You are now watching Cultural Survival's Global News Bulletin. Every month, Cultural Survival brings you the latest news impacting indigenous peoples across the globe. This August edition features important stories from Europe, North, Central, South America, Africa, Asia, and beyond. Starting news from World Court. Indigenous communities and small island nations disproportionately impacted by climate change now have a new legal tool. The International Court of Justice landmark ruling stated that countries failing to act on climate change may face legal consequences and be liable for reparations, giving those most affected a way to demand justice from major polluters. News from UN. On August 9, the International Day of World's Indigenous Peoples recognized the contributions of indigenous communities. This year's theme focused on artificial intelligence. While artificial intelligence can preserve languages and culture, the UN warned it could also perpetuate exclusion without proper governance and ethical safeguards. In USA, 60 years after the Voting Rights Act, Native American communities still face significant voting barriers. A recent court ruling in North Dakota limits tribes' ability to sue under Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act, undermining their political voice and ability to challenge discriminatory practices. The fight for equal access continues. In Canada, Indigenous groups in the Northwest Territories have finalized a $375 million agreement to protect 380,000 square kilometers of ancestral land. This landmark deal, a major step in reconciliation and conservation, will fund Indigenous-led stewardship, climate research, and cultural programs, empowering over 20 Indigenous governments to manage a vast area. In Australia, a new UN report backed by over 150 organizations reveals Australian governments have failed to implement recommendations from royal commissions and coronial inquests. The report presented before Australia's Human Rights Review calls for a national action plan and an independent Indigenous-led monitoring body to address systemic injustice and disproportionate harm. Now news from South Africa. A Khoi leader, Captain Edmund Wayne Stuurman, warns that the history and culture of the Khoi and San people are being erased. Speaking at a recent online workshop, Stuurman criticized the South African government for excluding their heritage from the national curriculum and for not recognizing them as First Nation people. He stated that the struggle is for survival and identity. In Kenya, the Ogek people of Kenya's Mau Forest are still waiting for justice, despite winning two landmark court rulings in 2017 and 2022 that affirmed their land rights and ordered reparations. The government has yet to enforce the decisions. The community remains displaced, with their ancestral land still out of reach. In Western Sahara, Christopher Nolan's filming of his epic The Odyssey in Western Sahara has been temporarily halted. Sahrawi activists and indigenous rights groups protested the decisions, arguing that the suit normalizes Morocco's occupation of disrupted territory and erases the struggle of the Sahrawi people. In Thailand's House of Representatives approved its first ever law protecting indigenous groups, with votes of 421 in favor out of 425. The landmark legislation aims to safeguard the traditions and the rights of 6 million indigenous peoples, addressing issues like land disputes and statelessness. The law will take effect 90 days after receiving royal assent. In Nepal, A new Amnesty International report reveals that forced evictions in Nepal are disproportionately harming indigenous and Dalit communities. The report, spanning from 2020 to 2024, details instances in which hundreds of families faced homelessness, underscoring a lack of adherence to legal safeguards and leading to substantial trauma. In Philippines, a new study reveals that Philippine indigenous communities like the Molobo Dulangan rely on 796 native plant species for medicine, preserving ancestral healthcare knowledge. This vital tradition faces threats from deforestation and a lack of government support, prompting calls for stronger environmental protections and official recognition of these practices. In Indonesia, Indonesia's Komodo National Park, home to the endangered Komodo dragon indigenous peoples of Indonesia, is under threat from large-scale tourism projects. The development of luxury resorts and commercial piers is endangering wildlife and displacing indigenous communities. Activists argue these projects ignore conservation guidelines and indigenous rights, risking a human rights and environmental crisis. In Colombia, in a landmark decision, Colombia's constitutional court ruled to protect indigenous Amazonian tribes from mercury contamination by illegal gold mining. The ruling, sparked by a 2019 lawsuit from tribal leaders, mandates urgent measures for 30 affected communities, setting a global precedent for environmental and indigenous rights. In Bolivia, Bolivia's lithium boom is sparking a water crisis for indigenous communities. A new study reveals planned mining operations on the Uyuni salt flat could consume 15 times the region's annual rainfall. Fearing for their livelihoods, residents of Norlipez have declared a state of emergency, mobilizing to protect their limited water supplies. In Ecuador, Ecuador's government has merged its environment and energy ministries, a move sparking outrage from environmental and indigenous groups. Critics argue the new ministry, now responsible for both conservation and extractive industries, will fast-track oil and mining projects, potentially undermining a popular referendum that protected the Yasuni National Park. In Peru, the world's largest uncontacted tribe, the Masco Piro, is at risk. Illegal logging and drug trafficking, intensified by the climate crisis, threaten their survival in the remote Peru-Brazil border region. Lack of new enforcement allows these activities to drive the tribe towards dangerous contact with outsiders, jeopardizing their existence. In Argentina, police forcibly evicted the Koja indigenous community from their ancestral land within a UNESCO World Heritage Site on July 7. The violent illegal dawn raid destroyed homes. Authorities suspect real estate interests. Despite the displacement, families have returned, vowing to fight for their land. In Costa Rica, in a landmark decision, the Savecar people of Costa Rica's Grano de Oro region have approved crucial conservation and development plans. The Association of Women Caretakers of the Earth led the vote, which saw 24 communities unite to protect their heritage, ancestral lands, and natural resources for future generations. In Brazil, in a powerful speech, Caiapo chief Raoni Metuctaer, receiving Brazil's highest honor, directly challenged President Lula's oil extraction plans in the Amazon. He warned against deep-water drilling, citing risks of pollution and climate change, and urged the government to prioritize environmental protection over economic gain. That is all for this edition of Cultural Survival's Global News Bulletin. Stay tuned for our next broadcast. For more information on the rights of indigenous peoples, visit cas.org and follow Cultural Survival on Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, Threads, and Blue Sky.